Welcome to the Sacred Child Summit. My name is Kathleen Sherrick and I'm your host. And I'm so pleased to welcome today Dawson Church. Dawson Church, Ph.D., is an award-winning science writer with 3 best-selling books to his credit. The Genie in Your Genes was the first book to demonstrate that emotions drive gene expression. Mind to Matter showed that the brain actually creates much of we think of as objective reality. And Bliss Brain demonstrates that peak mental states rapidly remodel the brain for happiness. Dawson has conducted dozens of clinical trials and founded the National Institute for Integrative Healthcare to promote groundbreaking new treatments. Its largest program, the Veterans Stress Project, has offered free treatment to over 20,000 veterans with PTSD over the past decade. Dawson shares how to apply these health and performance breakthroughs through EFTuniverse.com, one of the world's largest alternative medicine sites. Welcome, Dawson.
And Kathleen having a lot of fun doing it all too, so let's not forget the fun.
It sounds like a lot of heady work, but yes, you are you're fairly well known for your beautiful, wondrous laugh that can be infectious for everyone. So thank you for the whole spectrum of emotions that you bring to us.
Oh, it's a pleasure and a joy.
And so Dawson, you're here to talk with us today about bliss parenting. So what exactly is bliss parenting? Because every parent on the planet wants to know about this one.
You know, it really for me began organically, Kathleen. And when I was having my first child with my ex-wife, Brenda, who's a wonderful person. I'm still in touch with her. In fact, I was texting her this last weekend. We weren't ready. We weren't ready for a baby. And so for me, it was a big adjustment. And I found myself preparing for it in physical ways. Everyone does the things that are necessary to welcome a baby. But I also began to be aware of preparing for it in inner ways. And one day, when we were a few months pregnant, we were living in a little cabin in Mount Madonna, right at the top of Mount Madonna in Santa Cruz County in California. And I was outside and I was just enjoying the evening air before going to bed. And I suddenly became aware of a presence. And this presence felt like the energy of the baby. And so I began to commune like just hanging out, watching the sky with a friend. And that's how it all began, to really feel the inner presence of that being. And so over the years, it was so powerful to not just relate to my wife and to my son and my other children at the level of what I call in my books local reality. You also start to relate to the level of non-local reality. And if you're at the level of local reality, chugging along at the level of time and space and matter and all this physical stuff we have, you can be happy and have good times. Certainly will have good times with your partner and your children. But if you learn to inhabit the realm I talk about in my books of non-local reality, and you have a non-local connection with them, then you have access to intuition, you have access to spirituality, you have access to the all the peak emotional and mental states that we all human beings are all capable of being in. You're attuned as well at this metaphysical level. And suddenly, when you're framing your parenting journey in the context of non-local reality, when you're meditating, when you're downloading wisdom from that, like at times as a parent, I was totally baffled by what to do. I didn't know what to do about certain things. So what I would do is I would tune in to non-local reality and I'd get these inspirational ideas, or maybe before my son Lionel could speak, I just sensed something from him at that non-local level, and then had an idea about how to move forward. So that's how you make it blissful, is you release your focus on the stuff of material reality, the local reality you're in, and you make space and time in your life for non-local reality. And what you find in non-local reality is absolute bliss. I mean, I love bliss, joy, gratitude, compassion that'll just blow your circuits. So that's the way to do bliss parenting.
Wow. It actually sounds beautiful. And so the non-local reality, so it transcends time and space. Does that also include the fields that we embody? Because you talk about electromagnetic fields, you talk about thought fields, emotional fields, and this kind of thing. Are those also included in non-local reality?
Yeah, and back along the way, we talked about subtle energies and subtle fields and the biofield and all these concepts. And what's really wonderful about science is that we have ideas and hypotheses like that, and then we test them. And so now, over the last 20 years, we've been developing the technology to actually test these things. Like, for example, there are geomagnetic fields around the Earth. The Earth is a giant magnet. That's why compasses work. There's a North Pole, there's a South Pole, there's a magnetic field that looks a lot like a torus, a donut shape around the Earth. And it turns out we can measure this toroidal field. NASA has a huge amount of artwork and renderings showing what this field looks like. It fluctuates. And so we now are measuring these giant planetary information fields. They're actually bigger than the planet. They're at least as big as the solar system, probably as big as the galaxy, maybe as big as the universe. And so we start to function within those fields. And we're now getting experiments showing direct correlations between the fluctuations of things like those geomagnetic fields of the Earth and individual human physiology. So yeah, these fields are real. They affect us. They affect the whole world, and we can learn to attune to them. And the field of compassion, the field of grace, the field of kindness, all these positive emotions, we can literally, if I'm not feeling positive emotion, I can go look at a picture of Kuan Yin or Mother Mary and get in touch with that field of positive emotions. So there are lots of access points.
So emotions have their own energetic vibration as well.
Emotions are the drivers. Thoughts are useful and an interesting way to approach reality. And they do have some epigenetic effect. Again, epigenetics is something I've specialized in my research. It's the control of genes from outside the genome. And so thoughts have a mild epigenetic effect, but thought plus emotion has a marked epigenetic effect. And if you can feel emotion, especially positive emotion, then you can turbocharge all kinds of positive processes in your life. So emotion is key. Even in spirituality studies and brain function studies of Tibetan monks, Franciscan nuns, and other adepts, they find that one of the three key drivers of positive neuroplastic change in the brain is strong positive emotion. So yeah, fill your life up with it to the degree you can.
And so when we're talking about parenting, and especially early parenting, which is, it sounds like you've got some experience with this, there can be, when you're new to it, it can be stress involved. There can be things that we might otherwise consider to be novel experiences. And yet in the moment, we are concerned about, will my child survive my day to day? Because I'm not sure what I'm doing. And so in that kind of milieu of confusion and love and awe and wonder and all of that, how can we best use the concepts of epigenetics to kind of ground ourselves in what science is now showing is reality, instead of maybe in entertaining some fear around it?
Yeah, and it actually goes back even further than that, because cortisol, your main stress, cortisol is a master hormone. It turns on a bunch of genes, turns on a lot of other hormones and neurotransmitters. So it's the starting point. And if you are stressed psychologically, you make more cortisol molecules. You have a rise in cortisol. It then has this chain reaction. And there are a lot of downstream effects from cortisol. And so cortisol is one of those molecules that actually crosses into the baby from the mother. And so if the father's stressed, that tends to make the mother stressed, and that will definitely make the baby stressed. And so many of us, unfortunately, are learning to be stressed in the womb. We haven't even been born yet. We're already experiencing a rise in cortisol because our mother or our father has a rise in cortisol. So yeah, and parents, and again, I got to say that my early parenting experience with my kids was not easy, because my wife and I were just struggling in all kinds of ways in our lives. We were not doing well in our marriage. We were not doing well financially. And so we just had a ton of difficult problems. And so what do you find this ability to tune into something larger than yourself? I think the very first thing to do is make some time available in your week for self-care. If it's an old analogy about put your oxygen mask on first, then help the person next to you. But it's totally true in parenting. If you're depleted, you don't have a lot to offer, and you're certainly not going to be very wise in what you do offer. So what are you doing for self-care? Self-care does not have to mean going on a cruise, on a Disney cruise to the Bahamas, or going and having going to a luxury spa. That's people think of self-care in these often these very grand terms. Self-care is, to tell you, the pivotal day in my life when I did what changed everything. I was in a real crisis with one business doing really well. I was 45 years old. My kids were still pretty small. One business was doing well. I had a second business doing really badly. And I was totally stressed, working like 80 hours a week, taking care of the kids as well. Half time at that point, I just got divorced. And I made the commitment to meditate every day. And when I did that, Kathleen, that was the pivot point. And it meant getting up at 5:30 a.m. because they had to be at school by 7. And I had to get them up at 6:30 or 6:15. So the only way I could get a meditation in was setting my alarm clock that early. But the first day I did that, and I just did it the first day and the second day and the third day. And that was literally one of the primary turning points of my life. So that was self-care. And so do something like that. How much does it cost? Nothing. How much does going for a walk in nature cost? Nothing. How much does going and taking a hot bath cost? Nothing. We have all these ways in which we can give ourselves time, space for self-care. So spend 30 minutes with an inspirational book. Go read one of my books. Go read Swaran, go read Krishnamurti, go read Saint Teresa, go read Rumi. One of these inspired people, that's an act of self-care. That meditation is an act of self-care. That walk in nature is self-care. So it begins with that, whatever it might be, is your act of self-care. You're stepping out of the chaos for a little while. Now, the other 23 and a half hours of your life might be chaos, but now you've given yourself this anchor point in well-being. So do that the very, 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 very first thing.
The very first thing you say?
Very first thing.
And I have found that when you can do something like that early on in the day, the rest of the day can often take care of itself. Whether you are in nature, whether you are in prayer, whether you are chanting or meditating, or that the rest of the day can sometimes also align with what you have begun in the morning. So thank you so much for helping kind of set the stage for what a family day could look like if we were courageous enough in some ways to make a little extra time for us before everything else begins.
Absolutely, time for yourself. And there's research by a Harvard psychologist called Teresa Amabile, which I cover in my book, Bliss Brain. And what she's found is you put yourself in that state first thing in the morning. Now your brain function starts to change. And I won't go into a lot of detail here, but there are parts of the brain that have to do with suffering and stress that dial down. Parts of the brain have to do with creativity and wisdom that dial up. And if you do that first thing in the morning, your brain function actually changes for the following 48 hours. They can measure that you have enhanced brain function, specifically at increased creativity, productivity, and problem-solving ability. Your ability to solve problems. So now your kid is sick. Now your kid is hitting other kids. Now your kid is having test anxiety or social anxiety. Now you're wiser, you have enhanced problem-solving ability and creativity and productivity. So you're more productive. You become much more productive at work. In some studies, 5 times as productive at work. Suddenly you're getting a whole lot done, more done in a whole lot less hours. you have a lot more time for yourself, a lot more time for your family. In fact, I goofed off basically for about 10 years after I began to make these discoveries and hung out with my kids a whole lot.
What do you mean by goofed off? What do you mean?
I owned at that time. I kind of semi-retired. I owned a bed and breakfast, small hotel, and I just basically spent a few years just doing very little work and playing with the kids a whole lot.
That sounds really lovely. Some of the things that you talk about, thank you for mentioning research, because it really helps us ground in things that we might otherwise maybe intuitively sense, but more and more of the studies and the research that you are tying into are things that we might not really think about, we might not have considered at all. And so some of the work that's out there now is, do our thoughts really create our reality? Or are you saying our emotions maybe more create our reality? Or what's the truth here? And how can we use this as parents?
When I would hear that new age phrase, your thoughts create your reality, even though the Buddha said that, Ralph Waldo Emerson said that, Thoreau said that, Mahatma Gandhi said that. There have been all these people throughout history who've been telling us our thoughts create our reality. And I still was a little skeptical, but when I was writing Mind to Matter, I looked at the research, and it's amazing the degree to which our thoughts do create reality. And when they're turbocharged by emotion, even more so. So thoughts, beliefs about the world, which we have as emotional touchstones, really do affect the world around us. And just try this experiment. We had people do the meditations in the book for 22 minutes a day for 28 days. Now, this is not a long period of time, just 22 minutes a day, listening to a guided track. And this was a randomized controlled trial with MRIs. So these huge, big $1 million machines, putting people in MRIs, reading their brain function before and after 28 days. And those that did those meditations had changes in brain structure and brain function. Their brains were literally changing over the course of a month. So it does not take long for the reality of your brain start to change. Cortisol drops. It drops quite a bit. We found in one study that again, this is matter. This is thought and emotion driving matter. So we found that people's average cortisol level at a retreat where they were doing EFT, acupressure tapping, and they were doing meditation, their cortisol dropped by 37% in a week. Their immunoglobulins, immune markers, rose dramatically in that same week. So we're affecting the matter of our bodies. We're affecting the matter of the world around us. There's amazing research showing that this stuff over here, if you hold that water in an energy, in an intention of blessing and love, you literally change the water molecules in your water. I believe it's happening in food as well. So all around us, there are other studies showing that people in certain mental states can change things like the rate of radioactive decay. They can change the alkalinity of water. They can affect seed growth. They can affect the biological features of plants around them. So we're literally nudging the world around us in certain ways, and the molecules in our bodies in big ways. We're literally shifting this by thought and emotion.
And so if we direct that thought and emotion to preconception, to conception, to pregnancy, to these early days of life as we welcome children into our families, if we direct that, you're saying that we have probably more impact than we can ever imagine. Are there studies that show an impact about emotional states on the fetus or anything like that you know of?
There were some stunning studies done. And so we had a lot of animal trials showing that emotion affects the next generation using epigenetic tags. And these are little molecules that cling to DNA and then either promote it duplicating or inhibit that duplication of DNA. So these tags can either promote or they can suppress, silence a gene. And there was one study, a lot of animal studies showing this, and they show that emotion, in this case was fear. These were mice that were trained to fear a certain scent, a certain smell. And the fear epigenetic tag was measured 7 generations later across 7 generations in these mice. And then the stunning study that's now been replicated several times of the granddaughters of Holocaust survivors. So Holocaust survivors, epigenetic tagging, yeah, to do with fear. I mean, they grew up, they were in this terrifying situation in concentration camps, and then they went on and had children, and the children had children. And the researchers found the same epigenetic tags in the granddaughters as were present in the Holocaust survivors. So my strong recommendation is, if you're going to have a child, or whatever stage your parenting journey is at, clean up your act. Clean up your act spiritually, psychologically. Just get your life together, because you are passing that along not just to your children, but to your grandchildren, and probably for generations beyond that. So absolutely, there's plenty of evidence showing that's true. Emotion and belief and worldview, it's not just psychological, it is biological, and it produces shifts in subsequent generations.
Sometimes as new parents, we are trying to get a handle on the baby before us, and now to think of generations, that's quite a mind-expanding thought, to think that our emotions in this moment, or before that, as you're saying, to think about what we have experienced, what emotional filters we may carry into parenting, and to clean them up, as you said. Now, clean them up is an interesting term, because you have many different treatments that you have worked with, you've helped initiate, one of them being EFT, emotional freedom tapping. And so there are ways that we can clean up our act before we are parents, or even while we're parenting. Isn't that right?
Yes, before parenting and while you're parenting. I do also have a lot of people in my workshops. I teach a lot of live workshops at places like Omega and Esalen, and I also teach a lot of virtual workshops. And I often deal with people there who had children 20 years ago, 30 years ago, or maybe they have teenagers now, and they're filled with regret when they start to realize the effect of them just dumping all of their old stuff onto their kids, and their kids are now living out the same dysfunctionality. In fact, one of the founders of the whole field of family therapy was a brilliant therapist called Virginia Satir. She was active in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, one of the brilliant leaders of the human potential movement. And she said, again, she's one of the founders of the field of marriage and family therapy. She said, my definition of a marriage is two sets of dysfunctional family patterns getting together to propagate themselves into the next generation. And so that's how, after a lifetime of doing this, she saw it. And often we are doing that. So in my workshops, often people are filled with such regret. They say, if only I'd known this early on, I never would have acted the way I made toward my kids. So at whatever stage you're at, whether your kids are grown, whether they're almost grown, whether you haven't had them yet, use these tools, because research shows there are over 100 clinical trials of EFT tapping. And EFT tapping is just tapping on your acupuncture meridians like I'm doing right now. There are a bunch of these meridian points. You tap on them while you process negative emotion. It very quickly balances you and you feel better. And so whatever stage of the parenting journey you're at, just start to let go of your preconceptions, certainly of your negative emotions, and don't project those onto your kids. Clean them up in yourself. So EFT tapping is an essential way of de-stressing. It works just like that. It works about in 2 minutes. People shift, their cortisol goes down, their adrenaline goes down, all kinds of other stress hormones decrease, all kinds of really good biochemicals increase. So de-stress yourself. And if you're both giving yourself that half hour in the morning or 1 hour in the morning of journaling, of meditation, of connecting with your higher power, then you're giving yourself that initial framing for the day. But then when you get stressed, when you get impatient, when your old patterns come up that you inherited from your parents and they inherited from their great-great-grandparents, when those come up, you tap and you release those, and you don't say that stupid thing to your husband or your wife. You don't impose your unhealed emotional stuff on your kids, and the whole parenting journey changes. And that's when you get to the point where, you just sit there and you're in love. You're in love with your children. And now that mine are adults, we have grandchildren as well. It is a journey in love. There's nothing. If you had $100 million, you would not have as much wealth as you will have if you do this with your children at an early age, and then they grow up. Because when they grow up, they absolutely love and adore you. They think you're totally wonderful. They want to spend time with you. They go out of their way. Like, mine have all moved away to different parts of the country, but they fly in usually but every couple of months, hang out with my wife and I. There's so much love. If the payoff for doing this lasts a lifetime, so it's well worth doing.
Thank you for saying that the payoff can be long-term, because sometimes when you're in the moment and you're rushing to get out of the door and the baby has a dirty diaper, because that's when it always happens, when you're on a time schedule and you got to get somewhere. And it's more challenging to remember that something that you do in that moment could have long-term effects. And so you've been able to see it. And I appreciate you saying that. So EFT, can this be used with babies, with children? And I know that young children can be taught it. And yet with babies, is it something where the tapping would be done on the adult for the child, or how would this work?
Either or. And usually with teenagers, and later they'll tap on themselves. With young children, often you'll tap on them. And then there's a simple form of EFT, which I talk about in the EFT manual, called touch and breathe, where you don't actually tap on the acupuncture points, just touch them gently. Like one of our grandkids, a year-old, was sick and crying the other day. I just did a little bit of TAB, touch and breathe, on her, and she just stopped crying, and she centered herself. So that was me working on her, but they can learn to tap on themselves too.
And that's a very gentle approach. That sounds that you could do that while you're changing a diaper. You could do that
Yes.
while child is nursing or eating, or those kinds of things, it sounds like.
Yeah, you can do it during those times. And also, like, a few times I've been on a plane and there's been a baby who's crying, and often parents feel bad on planes because the young child's confined. The child isn't happy, maybe their ears are hurting, they certainly are not enjoying being strapped into a seatbelt. And so if I can, I make it a point to sit next to them. If I can change my seat and sit next to a couple with a child, I will, because I want them just to be bathed in love and appreciation and acceptance, and knowing how hard it is. Another thing I do sometimes is I just tap myself, and I hold the intention that the child will feel better. And it's been true a number of times that the baby stopped crying. I start tapping on myself. Maybe I'm 3 rows away, maybe I'm in the same row, and I tap on myself and the baby quietens down. So intention tapping like that can have an effect.
And so you and I are similar in that way. I look for the babies too to sit next to, so that mommy and daddy are okay.
Yeah.
And so when you are sitting several rows away, you are also then engaging in, I think in some ways you refer to it as a quantum field.
Yes.
And so we personally have some quantum fields that then interact with other people's quantum fields?
Our fields are large. They extend about 3 meters away from the body. That's the measurable. So if you're 6 yards away from somebody, 6 meters, then your fields are interacting in a big enclosed space like an airplane or a bus. You feel those fields. Now I'm highly energy sensitive, so I have to do some voodoo before I go into like a big box store or a parade or a crowd, because I need to like really just put a bubble around myself, because I can't deal with all that energy. So I do that, put that bubble around myself. Then I'm fine after I've done that. But there are all these energies bombarding us all the time. So it's really hard to regulate. And that's why it's important, if you're a parent, to regulate your own, because in the still face experiments at Harvard, starting in the 1970s, but they're still running today, amazing experiments. They showed, and I won't go into a long story about how they did the experiments, but they showed that the energy field of the parent or the caregiver regulates the energy field of an infant. So a 1 year old, 6 months old, 2 years old, a month old, all those young infants, they actually cannot regulate their automatic nervous system. It's regulated by the adults around them. And if the adults around them are all dysregulated, it literally dysregulates their fields. So when you're in these big fields, that's when you really need to be present and calm and centered, and then you help regulate the field all around you. And when you do that, like, when you're with a person, I met a few really elevated spiritual masters, and you walk into I remember one man I met, and as I came within 20 feet of him, I could feel this energy that he radiated all around him. And in chapter 2 of my book, Mind to Matter, I talk about the phenomenon, well-studied phenomenon called emotional contagion, and how our emotions literally affect those all around us. So you want to be one of those centered, loving people who's a force for emotional contagion. And then when you're in that plane, or you're in that big box store, or you're in that crowd, you are the center of love and compassion and joy and well-being. It then spreads all around you.
And what you're talking about is bringing a little new meaning to temper tantrums, because if our young children may have a temper tantrum, perhaps it's not actually their emotion. You say that they could perhaps be picking up on something of ours.
Absolutely, yeah.
So that's a different way to look at it as well, that this maybe is not something that is just within the child, because oftentimes they're seen as sponges. They take on a lot of things that are around them, and emotional contagion sounds like one of those things for us to be deeply aware of. You have talked about, Dawson, the Bliss Molecule, and you've talked about flow states and peak mental states. And so help us understand how this is something that in parenting or grandparenting or in a family with young children, how we can tap into and really try to live in that way. You've shared some ways to do it, like on a daily basis. Are there other suggestions that you have for us to be in a peak state of parenting or grandparenting?
Yeah, and those molecules are amazing. Like dopamine is your motivational molecule. Dopamine is the go-get-it molecule. I have an intention, I have a goal, I want something to happen. That's dopamine. Serotonin is the satisfaction molecule. It's like, oh, okay, it happened. I feel good now. So in meditators, dopamine can rise as much as 65%. So you have a lot of this motivational molecule going on. It also then triggers the release of serotonin. So now you have a lot of the satisfaction molecule going on, and you feel really, really good. If you have, what has also been measured is in meditators and people in flow states, their levels of oxytocin rise, and oxytocin is the bonding hormone. So it's the hormone that triggers uterine contractions. What's not well known, actually, so think about mothers, and it helps with lactation. So there's all this well-known literature on oxytocin and how it is this central bonding hormone between mothers and their children, between friends. They make lots of it. I discovered a study, which I write about in Bliss Brain, it's actually one of the primary hormones triggering the male erection. And this is not very well known, but actually people have better sex if the man has a lot of oxytocin as well. And it's really interesting to see that. It's so crucial to sexual function, to closeness, emotional function. And so you want to see oxytocin rising. In these people meditating, hitting flow states, they have big rises in oxytocin, which then in turn is another master molecule like cortisol that triggers the synthesis of other molecules, one of which is anandamide, the bliss molecule. And so you have all these pleasurable molecules, motivation, satisfaction, bliss in your brain, up to a 65% rise for dopamine alone, and in a whole bunch of other ones, and you just hit ecstasy. And that's why Rumi reads poetry, and he is in this absolutely ecstatic state. Or you read St. Teresa of Avila, and she's in this absolutely blissed out mental and emotional space. And so that's how you reach these spaces, and they're incredibly pleasurable, and they're incredibly addictive because anandamide has the same chemical structure as THC, which is the active ingredient in marijuana, and serotonin has the same structure as psilocybin, magic mushrooms, and dopamine is what's released in cocaine and heroin addiction. So you feel good and you feel addicted to all of these wonderful feel-good hormones and neurochemicals, and so then your level of pleasure and enjoyment, whether it's in parenting or in life, just skyrockets, and then everything you do becomes much easier. Again, there's that fivefold increase in productivity, creativity, and problem-solving ability. So now you're solving the problems in your life much more easily and effortlessly than you were doing before. So whether you're a grandparent, a parent, a foster parent, whether you are a caregiver, suddenly you're having a much better life because you spent that 30 minutes or an hour in the morning giving yourself that self-care space of meditation, making your brain feel good, seeing that 48-hour improvement in brain function described by Teresa Amabile at Harvard, and your whole life is now just seriously better. You make better financial choices. You make better choices about your habits and your exercise routines and your diet. So all kinds of other parts of your life begin to improve. And again, we found that this brain function, structure and function change happens in a month of doing this. So the key part of the brain too, in Bliss Brain, that changes the fastest, the most, is a part that regulates negative emotion. So where you, as before, you used to get angry or upset or irritable or resentful, now that part of the brain that regulates negative emotion, that is able to handle that emotion, that part of the brain grows by around 10% a month. A month.
A month?
A month. You can have, there's a case history in the book of a guy, it grew 22.8% in 2 months. So it's growing, your emotion regulation part of your brain is growing, and that results in resilience. So you're changing your brain fast and you're having a much better life. And it only takes a month to start seeing the difference.
And is this something you do refer to that we can, because of our body regenerating cells so often, and most people don't think of this on a daily basis. It's not, forefront in their thought process, but when our cells are regenerating, you talk about we can give ourselves an epigenetic makeover. And
yes.
is this what you're referring to?
Yes, because our cells we have 810,000 new cells being born in our bodies every second. And if those cells are being cultured in an energy of compassion and kindness and love and respect and tolerance, all those positive emotions, gratitude, then they're in an energy field in which there are all these nurturing frequencies happening. If we look at the brain waves of people in gratitude, for example, they're going to be producing a lot of alpha and theta waves. If we look at deep meditation, you're going to be producing a lot of delta waves. If you're in elevated emotional states and highly creative, you're producing a lot of gamma waves. And gamma is read by the body. Delta and theta are read by the body. Theta is associated with the repair of muscle cells, the repair of neurons, the repair of DNA. So you're literally generating frequencies which are having an epigenetic effect on your body by that meditation. And you might not see a big effect on your body the first week or the first month or the first year, but look at long-term longevity studies. We find that people with positive emotion tend to live at least 10 years longer than those who habitually make themselves a haven for negative emotion. So it'll affect your life substantially in a month. It'll affect your longevity dramatically over time.
And as we think about cell regeneration, of course, it starts with creation of cells, cell division in the very first place after conception. And
yes.
So when those cells are multiplying at the fastest rate ever in the womb, that this seems like something to be very conscious of if we're able to be generating these positive emotions and to now can the developing fetus tell the difference between what we intend with our emotions and how we might really be feeling?
No, the developing fetus isn't functioning mentally at all. In fact, for the first 2 years, two years after birth, the main part of the brain that's developing is the emotional brain. So it's the limbic system that's growing the fastest. Only later do the discriminating parts of the brain come online. That's also why psychological trauma is so damaging if it's early in life, because it's being experienced while the brain is taking shape. And so it's the emotional brain that's the most important part of the brain in terms of rapid growth. Later on, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, certainly by 9, 10, 12, then you see all of these intellectual parts of the prefrontal cortex firing and wiring. But initially, it's the limbic system that's happening. And if there are negative messages going in there, negative emotional messages, they can affect the child for life.
Now, in terms of non-locality and many of the tools that you've explained to us, like EFT and some of the wonderful work that you've been doing with veterans, which I understand is dramatically decreased and with long-term benefits for veterans with PTSD. So these are, let's see, I'm going to rephrase my question, but this is what you were, I think, saying through non-locality is that it's never too late to address what may have happened early in life. Is that correct?
That's one of the really wonderful discoveries we're finding as science looks at the cases of people who are hard to reach, who are damaged severely early in life. And I'm not going to pretend that there are, like in our Veteran Stress Project, we've done several studies. There are 7 randomized controlled trials of EFT for people with PTSD. And what they show is that 9 out of 10 people recover. They lose those nightmares, those flashbacks, the hypervigilance. So 1 in 10 doesn't recover. So this is not a panacea where everyone is going to recover, but 9 out of 10 do recover and have a massive drop in symptoms. But the one that doesn't recover tends to be the person who is really damaged early in childhood. So what we began teaching increasingly, we do workshops and we train people in EFT. And so we have specialized techniques for these that are pre-verbal. All that damage occurred before the acquisition of language. So this is a place where talk therapies, which is so useful in some situations, are not very effective because you're dealing with a part of the brain that was taking shape before language was acquired. So you need pre-verbal methods. So we have methods to use for early childhood trauma that are touch-based, and they work directly on the brain, they work directly on the body, but you need to have a lot of touch going on when you're dealing with that level of trauma. And so complete recovery is occasional and rare, but partial recovery is very, very common, even from severe childhood trauma.
This is, I think, brings some level of comfort to people who may have experienced things that they are becoming more aware of, and patterns that they may be becoming more conscious about. So thank you for sharing that. One of the situations that it occurs to me, and wondering how you might suggest using epigenetics and what we know about it, would be around the whole assisted reproduction with IVF, with surrogacy, with adoption. When you don't, when you may not know a donor to the genes and the genetic material of your child, how would you suggest that we use this epigenetic research around in a situation like that?
There are so many stories on EF Universe, and there are a couple of videos as well from people who had tried to get pregnant through IVF and weren't successful. And it's a pretty, there's a lot of moving pieces to IVF. And so, and then they learned tapping and they got pregnant. And I think part of the explanation is just lower stress. They weren't stressed. I mean, often people who are doing IVF, they're so stressed, they're so invested in the outcome that it's actually raising their cortisol and impeding their body's ability to do its natural thing. So that's one place to do it. Also, if you have, say you don't know who the donor is and you have worry about and fear about that, do some tapping to release those fears, release your own fears. If who knows who the donor was, but you can't work on that person. You can work completely on your own fear. So release the fear, lower your cortisol, deal with your own body, your own stressors, and your own personal situation. And you'll find that things usually will start to change in all the dimensions of your life. So that's where finding where you're holding tension, where you're holding stress, where are you stuck in your personal growth. Work with a practitioner. We have a wonderful new app called Stress Solution. You can just go on the app. You can literally have practitioners standing by. They'll literally work with you right off the bat on Stress Solution. And so just do whatever it takes to shift that reality into that calmness. Again, your cortisol will drop, all kinds of positive hormones and neurotransmitters will rise, and then you can deal with a far bigger range of possible outcomes. And you also invested in trying to make this whole thing happen.
I think that's, you make some very good points there. Some of the IVF women that I have worked with have color-coded charts to keep track of their schedule and when they need shots and what kinds of things they have to do. So it can be quite an involved process. Dawson, one of the books that was not mentioned earlier is an early book of yours, and it's how I first became familiar with your work many decades ago. And that book is called Communicating with Your Unborn Child. So yeah. I want to thank you for writing that book. And do you have any tips to share now that you also have some perspective from decades of having communicated with your own unborn children?
Yeah, and science does advance. And so I do write new books and we make new discoveries. And so the two things to be aware of is, one is to spend as much time as you can in elevated mental and emotional states. So you want to be in Bliss Brain and you want to be in that elevated state. You want to get to that point in the morning, hopefully, and then you frame your whole day that way. So that's the way to start your day, is with meditation. And then during a stressful day, when things don't go well during the day, that's when you tap. Tapping takes 2 minutes and suddenly you feel much calmer. So those are the two basic techniques I teach and recommend and use myself all the time. Then do whatever else supports you. Does movement support you? Bodies are meant to move. Are you walking? Are you doing yoga and Tai Chi? In my book, Mind to Matter, I list 30 things like grounding and time in nature you can use to support yourself. So really support yourself, love yourself in all of those ways. And when you do, what starts to happen is with tapping, you start to solve the trauma puzzle. All those traumatic things below the surface of your awareness, those all start to release. And that's why those veterans with PTSD, I mean, we're talking about people with severe clinical PTSD, 9 out of 10 of them just let it go. All those symptoms went away. But now what do? You're now at baseline, and that's nice. What do you then start to do? You then start to seek these elevated states of that Rumi or that St. Catherine, and those states are really accessible to us. We have a lot of wiring in our brain. In Bliss Brain, I talk about the Enlightenment Network and how a big chunk of our brain, huge systems in our brain, are all about having us have peak experiences. So you want to move into those experiences, and then you start to have those blissful experiences over and over and over again in parenting, in your relationship, in your work relationships, team relationships, your relationship with money, with your body, with aging, with death. You lose your fear of death. I mean, all kinds of things start to change when you're tapping into that relationship with non-local mind. So the kind of life you live in the future, if you do these things, if you meditate, if you tap, if you de-stress, is radically different from the one you would have lived had you not done those things. And that's why it's just so important to love yourself enough. And then I've mentioned 4 or 5 of them here. Make a list and just start doing them, and start right now.
What time is it? All right, right now.
While the iron's hot.
And it sounds like what you're saying is that when we are able to cultivate this other state of consciousness, that's also where we can be communicating with children who are yet to be born.
Yeah, you have all kinds of awareness of, just for example, connections with other people when you're in that space. And so whether it's a child that's maybe going to be born, whether it's someone who's died, you might feel the presence of someone who's died. You might feel the presence of guides, like the whole thing about contact with your higher power, your guides. Napoleon Hill wrote about this, and in his book Think and Grow Rich, he had a whole chapter 15, where essentially he's talking about his guides, his spirit guides. So there's a lot of literature of people getting in touch with these other realms, and whether they're imaginary or whether they're real doesn't matter. What matters is, are they helpful? And so they can be really helpful. For me, when I wrote Communing with the Spirit of Your Unborn Child 35, 40 years ago, I was in touch with the spirit of the energy of my child to be. And that, again, shaped my whole parenting journey. So you have access to wisdom when you are able to move to non-local that you just don't have at the local level. And so you find that wisdom spreads throughout your local life, and you do all kinds of interesting things, and you're dramatically happier than you otherwise would be. So that's the thing, that's the reason to invest in that relationship.
And that book, if I remember correctly, you mentioned like downloaded to you in a short period of time. Is that right?
7 days. I felt the presence of that being right there with me. That it was in the evening of a day in Santa Cruz County in California. I felt like his presence next to me. I felt his presence connecting with me. I walked inside, sat down at my Macintosh SE computer, which will tell you how long ago that was. And I wrote the book in 7 days.
Well, it sounds like you were in a flow state, Dawson.
Yep.
That's fantastic.
Get there, stay there.
This has been a wonderful conversation. Are there any other things that you would like to share with our audience?
Just go ahead and download my free EFT mini manual. It's free. Download the free meditation. That's free as well. You can get both of those on my website, dawsongift.com. That's just my name, Dawson, DAWSON, gift.com. And then look at that mini manual. There's a one-page explanation of EFT at the back. Download the meditation, begin meditating, use it every day. And again, you'll find that even if you're a failed meditator or inexperienced meditator, you'll find the instructions of that particular meditation really easy to do. So just download that stuff from dawsongift.com, start to use it. And again, keep a journal, see what happens in the next 30 days. It'll be good.
And Dawson, I want to offer a testimonial about that echo meditation, because it truly is for people who have a challenge of sitting still and quieting the mind and all. It is a meditation that includes the latest research about gratitude, about so many of the scientific things that you've shared with us today. And so a testimonial from myself that I have found it extremely impactful. So thank you for doing it.
I'm so glad.
So all of the links to what Dawson is offering to us today are found around the narrative, around all the area that accompany this video. So, and if you want to reach out to Dawson, his information is included here as well around this video. Dawson, thank you so much for the conversation today.
It's a pleasure. I'm so glad you're doing this amazing summit. So let's just see this reaching huge numbers of people and really inspiring them to change.
Thank you, Dawson.